Sex workers of Reddit, what is the weirdest thing you have done in your job? The hardcore LAR. One day, I was hired by a man who introduced himself as Lord Eldrick of the House of Flaming Dragon. I thought it was a bit theatrical but brushed it off. I realized I was in for something unusual when he handed me a full medieval gown and insisted that I address him as my lord. For the next hour, I was expected to roleplay as his captive princess, complete with scripted dialogue and a pretend sword fight. He provided foam swords. The cherry on top? The entire act was soundtracked by Gregorian chant music he played through his stereo. Now whenever I hear Gregorian chants, I can't help but laugh. The tax auditor. Then there was the guy who got a kick out of tax audits. Yes, you heard right. He wanted me to dress up like a tax auditor and conduct a mock audit on him. I had to learn all sorts of tax terminology and even had to give him a fake fine at the end. He would get all flustered and nervously shuffle his fake documents while I pretended to scrutinize them. He even insisted on using a real adding machine and printed me out a sheet of numbers to audit. The climax of the evening was handing him an envelope marked overdue, which for some reason, he found incredibly exciting. To each their own, I guess. The moral of these stories? Sex work is often thought to be dull and monotonous. But trust me, in my line of work, it's far from it. The poultry connoisseur. I had a client who requested that I dress up in a chicken suit. Okay, strange but nothing I couldn't handle. But then he wanted to dress up as a chicken too. We spent an hour clucking at each other, him ecstatic, me perplexed. The weirdest part? We didn't do anything explicitly sexual, just two chickens, having a good old time in a co-op he'd set up in his living room.
Story 1. The alien abductee. Early in my career, I was hired by this guy who claimed he was an alien abductee. He wasn't interested in the usual activities, but rather, he wanted me to dress up like an alien and do an abduction role play with him. That was weird enough, but then came the props. He had this ridiculous plastic UFO that he wanted me to descend from, which he'd rigged up with fishing wire from the ceiling. It was painted with all sorts of tacky glow-in-the-dark paint and looked like something out of a low-budget 70s sci-fi flick. He also had a bunch of tin foil probes, which he insisted I must use during the act. I spent a good half hour just trying not to laugh as I abducted him from his sofa. I'll say this, it was certainly out of this world.
The mime's miming lover. Okay, this one is a long one. Buckle up. In my early years, I had a repeat client who was a professional mime. He didn't speak, not even when we were alone, and all of our communications had to be done in pantomime. I've never laughed harder in my life than I did in those sessions, trying to figure out what he wanted me to do through exaggerated hand gestures and facial expressions. But the weirdest part of all of this was when he asked me to pretend to be a mime as well. One day he showed up with an extra mime costume, complete with a beret, a striped shirt, and face paint. I'm not proud of this, but I was really bad at it. The poor guy probably got more amusement from my terrible miming than anything else. Once, while I was trapped in an invisible box, I couldn't keep it together and burst out laughing. This apparently broke character, and he had to release me from the box. Even though it was one of the strangest things I've ever done, it was genuinely one of the most fun experiences I've had in this job. I can tell you, I have a newfound respect for mimes. The night at the museum. Several years ago, I got a request from a client who identified himself only as Mr. X. This mysterious moniker was just the beginning of one of the weirdest nights in my career. The instructions were simple. I was to wear a formal evening dress and meet him at a prominent city museum at exactly 11 p.m. I arrived to find the entire museum was closed, except for one lone security guard waiting for me at the entrance. Ah, you must be the lady Mr. X is expecting, he said, his old face wrinkling into a smile. He led me through a maze of exhibits and galleries until we reached the Egyptian section. There, bathed in the dim, dramatic lighting of the gallery, was Mr. X, standing proudly beside a giant replica of a pharaoh's tomb. Welcome, he said, his voice echoing through the silent museum. He was a middle-aged man with an air of sophistication, wearing a tuxedo that looked like it cost more than my rent. He handed me a script. I was to play the role of Cleopatra, he was my Antony, and the museum our palace. He had taken the time to write an entire play, complete with monologues, dialogues, and even stage directions. The plot was a bizarre mix of history and steamy romance, with a dash of Tomb Raider adventure thrown in. We spent the night performing this play, with scenes set across different exhibits. I delivered a passionate monologue under the T-Rex skeleton, we argued next to the medieval armor, and reconciled under the starlit ceiling of the planetarium. The strangest moment came when we enacted a death scene, beside an exhibit of stuffed animals. As I died, dramatically in his arms, he shed actual tears. Cleopatra, why must the gods take you so soon? He lamented to the bewildered gazes of stuffed lions and zebras. Finally, as the sun began to rise, our play reached its end. We were back at the pharaoh's tomb, where he thanked me for the unforgettable night, paid in cash, and even left a generous tip. He departed as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving me alone in the museum with the bemused security guard. As I walked out into the early morning light, clutching my script and my payment, I couldn't help but chuckle. In a job where I thought I'd seen it all, that night was definitely one for the history books. That's the end of this video. If you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe, and if you want your story to be featured, email it to redditstories2722@gmail.com.